In this video, let's talk about late Harappan phase. Before we go into the lecture, let me ask you a question. Consider the following statements regarding late Harappan culture. 3 statements have been given here, and the question is which of the above statements are correct. The first statement is double cropping was practiced in this period. In this period simply means late Harappan period. The second statement is Lothal was an important settlement of late Harappan phase. The third statement is trade with Afghanistan and Mesopotamia proliferated in this period. If you know the answer to this question, please answer in the comment section. So we have divided Harappan civilization into 3 phases. In our previous lectures, we have completed pre-Harappan phase and we have also discussed about mature Harappan phase. From the exam point of view, mature Harappan phase is the most important part of the syllabus. Now, in this video, let's talk about late Harappan phase. Late Harappan phase is also called as sub-Indus culture. If we talk about the timeline of late Harappan phase, it started somewhere around 1900 BCE and it ended around 1300 BCE. So what exactly is late Harappan phase? Late Harappan phase simply means that the mature Harappan phase has declined. So therefore, the period of this decline is simply called as late Harappan phase. So what do we mean when we say the word decline? Decline of mature Harappan culture means that there was a general decline in terms of size of the Harappan cities as well as the grandeur of Harappan cities. We can understand if there was a decline in size, which means that the city has become smaller. What does it mean when we say there is a decline in grandeur of Harappan cities? It simply means that the settlements in late Harappan phase were not as impressive as mature Harappan phase settlements. And in mature Harappan phase, the settlements were mainly cities. But in the case of late Harappan phase, the settlements were mainly villages. And generally, cities are more impressive than villages. That is why we say that there was a general decline from mature Harappan phase to the late Harappan phase. So what happened in late Harappan phase was, many people actually either abandoned the cities or they left the Harappan cities which were built during mature Harappan phase. Now, if they leave the cities, where did these people go? They moved eastwards as well as southwards. After moving eastwards and southwards, these people settled in smaller villages there. So we can say that late Harappan phase started when people started to leave the cities and went to live in the villages. When we talked about mature Harappan phase in our videos, we called it as an integration era. Why did we say that? Because in pre-Harappan phase, there were many regional cultures. We have already talked about regional cultures like Amri Nal culture, Damsadat culture, Hakraver sites and all these. So what mature Harappan phase did was, it integrated all these regional cultures into a single mature Harappan culture. That is why we called mature Harappan culture as integration era. However, what happened in late Harappan phase was, people left the cities and went to live in the villages. In the villages, they formed their own different cultures. In the villages, the new culture was not integrated anymore. That is why we call late Harappan phase as a localization era or a localization period. So I hope you got the meaning behind integration era and localization era. Integration era mainly applies for mature Harappan phase, but localization era applies for late Harappan phase. Now let's talk about the settlements that were built by late Harappan phase people. We know that mature Harappan phase was mainly an urban Bronze Age culture. However, we just learned that during the late Harappan phase, people left the cities and started to go and live in the villages. That is why the urban culture became a rural culture in late Harappan phase. Moreover, the usage of bronze also declined. They started using only copper. That is why the late Harappan phase became a Chalcolithic culture. So that is why we can call the late Harappan phase as a rural Chalcolithic culture. Rural because the people were living in villages. Chalcolithic because people were not using bronze tools anymore, but they were using only copper tools. So when people started to leave cities and go and live in the villages, we know that the size of a village would generally be smaller than a city. That is why the number of villages increased, because the population was almost same. Initially, they were living in a few cities. Now they were living in many villages. That is why the number of settlements or the number of villages increased, but the size of settlement or size of village decreased. We must note at this point that all cities were not abandoned at the same time. Some urban centers even existed during late Harappan phase. However, most of them were villages. That is why we call late Harappan phase as rural, although there were some urban centers or cities. If we talk about some of the urban centers or cities that existed in late Harappan phase, we can give examples like Bet Dwarka, which was in Gujarat, Daimabad, which is located in Maharashtra. In our previous videos, when we talked about the geographical extent of Indus civilization, then we said that Daimabad was the southernmost location of Harappan civilization. At this point, you have to note that Daimabad was actually a settlement which was built in late Harappan phase. That is why we can say that the southernmost late Harappan site is nothing but Daimabad, which is located in Maharashtra. If we are talking about only mature Harappan phase, then the southernmost mature Harappan phase site would be Malwan, which is located in Gujarat. So both these may be useful for you from the point of view of prelims exam. However, if a question is asked in the prelims exam like, what is the southernmost Harappan site? Then it would be Daimabad. Because when you just say Harappan site, you have to include pre-Harappan site as well as late Harappan site also. That is why the correct answer would be Daimabad and not Malwan. If Daimabad is not given in the option, then you have to select Malwan. Moreover, during the late Harappan phase, there was a decline in urban life. We have just said that people left the cities and they went to live in the villages. So the urban life declined. Moreover, there was one more important change. That was, there was a diversification in agriculture. What do we mean by diversification in agriculture? It means that people were now growing a different kind of crops. They were growing more number of crops even when compared to mature Harappan phase. That is why one major important development that happened in late Harappan phase is the diversification of agriculture. So overall, we can say that the two most important features of late Harappan phase were, the first one is decline in urban life and the second one is the diversification of agriculture. So both these things actually are the two aspects that represent a transition from mature Harappan phase to late Harappan phase. When we say decline in urban life, we mean that the standards declined. For example, the grid layout that was common in all Harappan cities was not there anymore. The very impressive drainage system that was there in all Harappan cities was not being used anymore. So in that meaning, the standard of urban life decreased. Moreover, the stylistic diversity also increased. This is very, very important. You must understand why. Because initially, people were living in a few number of cities. But in late Harappan phase, people moved into villages and they were living in different villages. Different villages started to create different kind of lifestyles for themselves. They were growing different kind of crops. They were making different pottery. And all such things mean that stylistic diversity of late Harappan people was very high compared to mature Harappan people. Now let's talk about agriculture in late Harappan phase. We just said that there was a diversification in agriculture. It simply means that the agricultural base has increased. The number of crops that were being grown has increased. Moreover, people in late Harappan phase also invented double cropping. What do you mean by double cropping? Double cropping simply means that growing two crops in a year. So if you grow two crops in a year, it would be called as double cropping. If you grow only one crop in a year, then it would be called as single cropping. If you grow three crops, then it would be obviously called as triple cropping. In India today, triple cropping is also practiced in many places. For example, in West Bengal, rice is grown in triple cropping method. It means that rice is grown 3 times in a year. In China also, mostly triple cropping of rice is practiced. This term is very important from the point of view of geography as well as economy. So double cropping was practiced by late Harappan phase people. They grew wheat and barley as winter crops, and in summer they grew rice, millets and sorghum. Moreover, during the late Harappan phase, rice also became an important crop. We know that rice was grown in Gujarat during mature Harappan phase. But rice was not an important crop even during that time. Many experts believe that mature Harappan people grew rice, but they did not eat that rice themselves. They actually fed this rice to animals. However, during the late Harappan phase, people were also eating rice. Therefore, rice became important crop. However, we must note that wheat and barley were also very important crops during this time. Now let's talk about trade in late Harappan phase. Late Harappan phase people were mainly living in villages. That is why both the internal trade as well as external trade that was done by late Harappan people was very less compared to mature Harappan people. So late Harappan phase basically marks a decline and afterwards an end of Harappan trade with West Asian centers. For example, Afghanistan and Mesopotamia. So at the start of the late Harappan phase, the external trade with these two regions declined and eventually it also ended. How do we know this? We know this because from around 1900 BCE onwards, there was a decrease in the number of items that were made using lapis lazuli, chert, carnelian beads, copper, bronze vessels and all these. And most of these things were actually imported. So if we are not finding these things after 1900 BCE, it means that their imports decreased. So that is why most of these items from late Harappan phase are either absent or very less. So not only external trade but also internal trade declined. However, we must note that there were certain cities which were continuing trade even during late Harappan phase. One of such city or one of such settlement was Lothal. Moreover, Lothal actually became prominent during late Harappan phase because Lothal was founded late compared to other Harappan cities. For example, we know that Harappa and Mohenjo-daro actually were existing from pre-Harappan phase times. However, Lothal was very new because it was founded only 4200 years ago, or we can say 2200 BCE. This was just 300 years before the start of late Harappan phase. Moreover, Lothal was also having access to sea coast. Coastal trade could also be done from Lothal. So all these reasons are important because Lothal was prominent during late Harappan phase, unlike Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Rakhigarhi and all these cities. Moreover, most of the cities were not doing trade with Mesopotamia and Afghanistan. That is why Lothal basically acted as a trade center between Harappan civilization and remaining part of India on one side and ancient Mesopotamia, Afghanistan, Iran and other regions on other side. That is why trade was surviving in Lothal even during late Harappan phase. Now let's talk about the artwork that was done in late Harappan phase. We know that mature Harappan phase was basically an integration era. That is why in mature Harappan phase, there was a high degree of uniformity or high degree of standardization in terms of artwork. However, in the late Harappan phase, people started to move into the villages and that is why we call late Harappan phase as localization era. So because of this localization, the high degree of standardization that was existing in mature Harappan phase was now slowly lost. And eventually, the culture itself has fragmented. Fragmentation of culture simply means that it was not uniform or standardized anymore. There were many subcultures that came from mature Indus culture. That is why we also call late Harappan phase as sub-Indus culture, or we can say sub-Indus cultures because there were actually many cultures. We call all these cultures under a name of late Harappan phase. So as the uniformity and standardization of artwork has decreased, what happened was there was a high diversification in styles as well as practices. It means that different villages were now having different style and different practice of making artwork. For example, local styles of pottery were there, local styles of brick making, copper implements making and all these. This is very important from the point of view of prelims. During late Harappan phase, there was a high diversification in terms of styles and practices of people. Moreover, the standardization which developed during mature Harappan phase declined during late Harappan phase. We must note that in many of the regions, actually these changes were not abrupt. Rather, they were very gradual. But eventually what happened was material cultures like pottery, seals, script, weights, town planning, standard bricks that were being used in mature Harappan phase gradually disappeared. Particularly, if we talk about pottery, we know that in mature Harappan phase, the kind of pottery being done was plain pottery and red and black pottery. When we discussed Harappan pottery, we said that red and black pottery was basically the characteristic pottery of mature Harappan phase culture. Since there was a diversification in style of pottery in late Harappan phase, what happened was these people were not making red and black pottery anymore. They were making another kind of pottery which was called as painted greyware. And this painted greyware is not as impressive as red and black pottery. Red and black pottery was actually very stylized, but painted greyware was basically less bright as well as less impressive compared to red and black pottery. So many villages in late Harappan phase were actually making painted greyware pottery. That is why we can call late Harappan phase culture as PGW culture also. PGW simply means painted greyware. Since late Harappan phase was basically a rural Chalcolithic culture, PGW culture is also nothing but a rural Chalcolithic culture. We will talk more about PGW culture when we talk about Chalcolithic culture in India. The last important development was the late Harappan sites did not make human figurines anymore. We know that mature Harappan phase people were making mother goddess terracotta figurines. They were also making other female figurines. But in late Harappan phase, human figurines were not being made. Or even if they were being made, their number was very less. Now let's talk about the geographical location of late Harappan phase sites. We can divide late Harappan phase into 5 geographical zones. Please remember that in some books, both these zones are basically combined into one zone which is called as Punjab zone. But for the sake of understanding better, let us study it as 2 different zones. So the first zone is basically the West Punjab zone, which is in Pakistan. This phase is also called as Cemetery H phase. When you hear the word Cemetery H phase, then you have to associate it with late Harappan phase. And this phase actually was first found in Harappa. And within Harappa, in a site called Site H. That is why it is called as Cemetery H phase. Other than this, you don't need any more information. The second zone is basically East Punjab phase, which is in India, particularly in Haryana as well as Punjab. The third zone is Jukar phase, which is in Sindh province of Pakistan. Some of the important sites in Jukar phase are Jukar, Perak, Mohenjo-daro, Chanhu-daro and Amri. Please note that Mohenjo-daro was also an important mature Harappan culture city. But people were also living in Mohenjo-daro even during late Harappan phase. The fourth zone is Rangpur phase, which is mainly found in Gujarat. Please remember this. This is very important from the point of view of prelims. The fifth zone is Ganga Yamuna Doab phase, which basically spreads up to western Uttar Pradesh. For example, the site of Alamgirpur, which is in Uttar Pradesh, is actually a late Harappan phase site. Alamgirpur is located close to Meerut. So these are basically the 5 zones or 5 distinct regions of late Harappan phase. You only need to know about the name of these zones. So some of the important sites of late Harappan phase are Prabhaspatan, which is also called as Somnath, which is located in Gujarat. Rangpur basically belongs to Rangpur phase or Rangpur zone of late Harappan phase. We also have Swat Valley in Pakistan. We have Manda in Jammu. In our previous videos, we have learnt that Manda is basically the northernmost Harappan site in India. So here we have learnt that Manda is basically a late Harappan phase site. We have Sanghol in Punjab and Daulatpur in Haryana. So this is about the late Harappan phase. If you like this video, please subscribe. You can download this presentation from our Telegram channel. The name of the channel is IAS Project. You can find the link for this channel in the description section below. Thank you.